Welcome back to Educator.com. This lesson is Editing Basics Part 1. In this lesson, we will be discussing what the editor does. And in that, we'll be describing and talking about that the editor tells a story, creates narrative space, creates narrative time, and of course, so much more. We're going to be discussing some of the basics of what the editor does and how they achieve it, what tools they use as part of their tool chest. In order to really understand this and grasp this, we're going to have to discuss and describe the language of editing, because after all, that is what an editor is doing, is speaking with the language of editing. So we will define and describe the basics of that language, the various elements that are part of creating and manifesting that language. We will also, to that end, we will be defining and describing what's inside the frame. What is it that they're working with inside the frame? So this lesson, we will be reviewing the different visual and sound elements that editors can shape as part of their language. Let's begin. Okay, so what does an editor do? This is, they always say editing is the unseen of art form step within the process of making videos and films. At the end of the day, what does an editor do? Even if it is a non-narrative, a non-fiction, the editor is telling a story. You'll hear people say again and again that the editor or the edit is the last rewrite. So you've had a script, you've directed it, you've worked with performers, cinematographers, and now you hand over all that footage to the editor, whether it's you doing the edit or someone else, and you're going to rewrite your story, essentially, or rewrite your show. And so what are the components of that rewrite? Well, the editor is building characters, actually defining who the characters are in your program. And in order to do that, one of the main parts that they focus on is building performances. And we're going to talk a little bit about that more in detail. To that end, they create story arcs. So every story tends to have, most stories, unless they're maybe not the most exciting stories, but exciting stories have a bit of an arc to them. And the editor is shaping that, they're building that. So to that end, they have to define the plot and the events of the story. Editors also create what we call narrative space and narrative time. After all, when the editor is working with the footage, they have to keep track of what the physical space is, also the psychological space, and also the narrative and psychological time, and the reality of the time chronology. Okay, so let's talk about creating space. This is one of the most important parts of an editor's job, because if they don't keep track of the space, their audience, their viewer is going to be completely confused. Sometimes we want to confuse editors in horror films. Not confuse editors, confuse our audience. Sometimes, like in a horror film, we want it to not be completely clear how far the bedroom is as the main character's walking down that scary hallway. So editors create space, and in order to do so, they have to have a sense of the real space that was captured with the video, with the footage. But then they're going to create what the narrative space, and this can be a cinematic space, meaning cinematically what we see, but it also is their psychological space that we can talk about, or that one can talk about when you're thinking about back to that horror film. So you have one character walking down a scary, creepy hall. Maybe in real life that hall was not as long as the editor, through their various use and manipulation of the language, they can extend and make that cheat, so make that hallway to look longer and feel longer. So that space is cinematically longer, but then there's also a psychological element to it. So editors, they construct the space via shot choice. And in order to really do that, they have to do two things. They have to think of it as a mental map, that you as the editor must keep track of the real space that was shot, that is, and the constructed space. And in doing so, they can cheat. They can make space look and appear on video, on film, different than it really was in real life.